What it do, Dream Team? Welcome back to another reaction video where we get to learn more history. We're back with Thomas Sowell, The True History of Freedom Never Taught in Schools. In a recent video of his, I was taught that a lot of things that we have in America actually came from the British. That the Constitution pulled a lot of things from the Magna Carta, and so that freedoms and everything that I would believe that America had given us, a lot of it actually did come from the British. So I wanted to learn more about this and get to learn more history. So that's why we're here. So let's go ahead and dive right in.
Britain's economic pioneering and imperial triumphs were by no means its only legacy to the world. Freedom, wherever it exists in the world today, owes much to developments in Britain. These include not only the historic evolution of a free society in the United Kingdom itself, providing political models and legal precedents for other free societies around the world, but also Britain's key role in destroying the international slave trade in the 19th century and its crucial role when the survival of freedom in the world was threatened in the early and dark days of World War II. Freedom was by no means a constant throughout British history, nor did it grow smoothly over time. In the repeated jockeying for power between kings and parliaments, between religious denominations, or between nobles and commoners, the boundaries of freedom were frequently shifting. Nevertheless, the idea of separated powers and of rules governing all the contenders for power became embedded in British tradition over the centuries. The uneven, uncertain, and inconsistent evolution of the institutions and traditions of freedom in Britain followed no blueprint or elaborated doctrine. Its pattern is more discernible in retrospect than among those living through those historic centuries, preoccupied with fierce rivalries between dynasties, churches, courts contending among themselves for jurisdiction, foreign wars, and the enduring and bitter battles at home between parliament and monarchs. Out of this apparent chaos, however, emerged institutions, traditions, and landmarks on the road to human freedom in general, as well as for the freedom of the British themselves.
So saying, from what I've heard, it just seems like freedom hasn't been around forever, right? And even in the beginning of the British Empire, freedom wasn't necessarily there, as you had so many things, so many forces, I guess, fighting against each other, and always the line of freedom being pushed, as in like what's allowed and what's not allowed. That line's always been pushed, whether it be like government and churches, parliament, or people in power and regular civilians. That line is also always being pushed for freedom. But due to the British and kind of figuring out this balance of power and figuring out these institutions and how to best give everyone these freedoms, a lot of other countries around the world kind of took from the systems that the British had in place. And that's why a lot of freedoms exist around the world, is because people were able to learn from the freedoms that the British had in place. I believe that's what he was saying in the beginning. Could be wrong, but that's kind of what I got from it.
As well as for the freedom of the British themselves. The first and most famous of these landmarks was, of course, Magna Carta, a political agreement which avoided armed conflict growing out of narrow and bitterly disputed interests between King John and his nobles, and whose historic significance for the rest of the people of England, and ultimately the world, may not have been at all obvious when this political compromise was adopted in 1215. King John had provoked this incipient rebellion among his nobles by heightened taxation and other extractions of money under numerous pretenses, all in hopes of being able to finance a reconquest of his lost territories in Normandy. Yet, from this dispute among a small ruling elite came the tradition that people had established rights which even the king himself was required to respect. This meant that kings and queens of England could not be absolute monarchs, as rulers in so many other parts of the world were, and that the separation of powers became part of the basic political structure of the country.
Oh, wow.
While the kings of England retained enormous...
That is something I didn't know. So separation of powers came from the British as well, from King John, wanting so badly to raise taxation to be able to go and conquer the lands of Normandy. when he had his lost lands in Normandy, and I guess he had these faults among the elite, among the people beside him in power, with power, and he tried to get, I guess, stage or he tried to scheme and plot against them. We'll say that. That's the best way I can put it. Tried to scheme and plot against them, but that's when it became into. That's when it became that King John was like, no, that the monarch, whoever is the king or queen of Britain, shall not have absolute power, shall not be an absolute monarch like in other countries. There will be a separation of powers, and these powers can help balance each other. So that separation of powers, it's intriguing to know that that actually came from the British.
Enormous prerogatives for hundreds of years, they were increasingly confronted by Parliament, which was a powerful counterweight because of its control of taxation. Separated powers meant mutually limited powers, powers delineated in advance, as rulers and parliaments sought to guard the boundaries of their respective prerogatives, with the net result, over the centuries, of freeing an expanding portion of the population from arbitrary edicts. The fact that Britain was an island, dependent for its military defense primarily on its navy, meant that for much of its history, large standing armies were unnecessary and unknown, and were regarded with great suspicion. Since navies are not usable for domestic oppression like armies, both the government and the people were spared the dangers long inherent in standing armies. For much of its later history, the British landed aristocracy, unlike that in some continental European countries such as Russia, was locally based, both in economic and in political power terms. This meant that the landed nobility threw its weight behind a decentralization of power, especially since these local elites would themselves exercise much of that power as justices of the peace and in other roles.
Okay.
By contrast, the Russian nobility derived much of its economic sustenance and political power from its role as either military or civil agents of the central government, and therefore threw its weight behind Tsarist despotism. However locally despotic the British aristocracy might be in particular places and times, the decentralization which it promoted and its enduring opposition to large standing armies served to prevent the greater despotism possible by a centralized government. There were numerous overlapping jurisdictions in the law between religious and secular courts, and between baronial and royal jurisdictions, while many local legal traditions further fragmented the legal system of Britain. Over the centuries, however, there emerged a body of law common to the country as a whole, laws growing by the accretion of judicial precedents and known as the common law. Because the common law was not simply the creature of political power holders, it became another of the forces for separation of powers and of rights limiting the scope of officials. A second landmark in the evolution of English government were the series of armed struggles between Parliament and King in the 17th century, punctuated by the beheading of Charles I in 1649 and the flight of James II in 1688 in the face of uprising.
Britain did the unthinkable and sent its own monarch to his death, but this was a justified measure to preserve the peace or an act of needless brutality. But was this? I'm sure he's about to explain what happened, but it's just great to know that there was a separation of powers, that there was not one person who was totally in control. This separation of powers, it made you use cooperation, right, to decide what's best for everyone instead of what's best for the few. By separating these powers and diluting the power that each person has, they had to come together and decide what's going to be best for the many, what's going to be best for everyone. And so I think that's truly incredible, and not having these standing armies absolutely helped, because, you know, tensions rise, having that standing army there. It could have been detrimental, but with the British depending on their navy more so than any standing armies, they didn't have that. And so, again, the relationship between the monarch and Parliament was still there, and between Parliament and the people. It wasn't never one just overruling the other. It was them working in cooperation to decide what's best for everyone. And I guess, I'm not sure what happened with King Charles. Like I said, I'm sure he's going to explain. But King Charles might have thought he was an absolute monarch and tried to overextend his power, and they were like, no, 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 and that's what happened. We're about to find out, though.
Risings against him and defections from his own supporters. At the heart of these events were the attempts of successive Stuart monarchs to wield more arbitrary power than Parliament was prepared to tolerate. After a decade without a king, following the overthrow and execution of Charles I, England restored the Stuart monarchy in 1660, when Charles II ascended the throne. But after his death in 1685, his son James II returned to attempts at arbitrary rule, such as had doomed his grandfather. Far more important and of more enduring consequence than the changing of monarchs that followed, however, was the Bill of Rights proclaimed under the new monarchs, William and Mary, seeking to consolidate support for their newly established reign. Law was made supreme, with the king no longer empowered to remove judges, who now became arbiters between crown and subject, acting on standards of law. While an independent judiciary had been the ideal before, what made it revolutionary now was that it became a reality when judges' appointments could no longer be revoked except for misconduct, and that could be done only by Parliament, which was itself removable by the electorate. This was part of a more general restructuring of government to produce greater freedom and religious toleration, as well as the rule of law. Beyond the Bill of Rights itself, but in the same spirit, freedom of the press from prior censorship was instituted in 1695. All these things, which are now so much taken for granted, can be taken for granted only because the British pioneered in their development. Moreover, Britain as a nation became a stronger international force as internal, dynastic, and religious strife subsided, and Parliament became more willing to supply monarchs with the funds needed to build up the country's military and naval forces, now that they no longer feared royal despotism. Thus, Britain was able to counterbalance the military threat that France posed to the British Isles and to the rest of Western Europe. Because Britain was an island nation, the revolutionary doctrine that people had rights which kings could not override was able to be fought out and won within the British Isles, without effective intervention from other monarchs on the European continent, to whom such doctrines were an obvious threat, even though both Charles II and James II had sought such intervention in order to try to save their throne and their royal prerogatives.
I feel like what I'm learning so far, I feel like America basically gained so much from the British when revolutionizing from Britain, because I guess they wanted to do things the way they wanted to do them. But at the end of the day, so many of the things, as far as a balance of a balance of powers. You know what I'm saying? There's always a power to check this, so nobody's ever too powerful. Nobody ever gets absolute power. Okay, that came from the British. What was I just gonna say? He had just said something else that I feel like America does as well. Inalienable rights, right? People have rights that not even the king can, I guess, dismiss is the word I'll use. There's a lot of times words just don't come to my mind, and so I have to think of the next best. So people have rights that the kings just can't dismiss and say no. No, they have inalienable rights. I think it's incredible to learn this, because this is all before America broke off as its own nation and gained its independence from Britain. So even though it gained its independence, you look and it's like, dang. Well, the way the British did things is basically the way America does things. So it took, even though it broke off and became independent, it took all of these great things that Britain had already put in place, all these great systems that Britain had in place, and used the same systems. This is awesome.
Intervention in order to try to save their throne and their royal prerogatives. The triumph of this revolutionary concept of political freedom and the emergence of Britain as a great power on the world stage marked, as a distinguished British historian put it, a turning point in the history of our country and of the world. The repetition of the same phrase, Bill of Rights, a century later, to describe the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States, was one of the first emanations of these principles beyond the shores of the British Isles. It would not be the last, however, as the ideas of political freedom and the rights of citizens spread to other European nations and their offshoot societies overseas, and to other civilizations. Even where these ideas did not triumph or endure, they were ideas difficult to extinguish, and sometimes they modified at least the appearances, and in some respects the practices, of authoritarian governments. As British parliamentary government became the mother of parliaments in other countries, so the British legal system became a model for other countries, thereby promoting freedom for other peoples and other countries. While British law spread around the world directly with the development of the British Empire, the concepts it introduced and the traditions it nurtured continued long after many colonies became independent nations.
Yes.
This was especially so in transplanted British societies like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. However, even in an outwardly different political and legal system in the United States, the same underlying principles of limited government, separation of powers, and an independent judiciary were at the heart of the American Constitution.
It's crazy.
British political and legal principles sometimes left an enduring influence, even in some former British colonies with non-Western populations and non-Western traditions of government. British legal principles and precedents continued to be cited in the courts of independent India, and an independent Sri Lanka for a time continued to permit its legal decisions to be appealed to the Privy Council in London. Not all former British colonies established or preserved British governmental structures or principles, or the freedom based on them. But the line of demarcation between those that did and those that did not largely coincided with the line between free people and those living under various forms of despotism. Freedom must be distinguished from democracy, with which it is often confused. The British people had many rights that were lacking in much of Europe and in most of the rest of the world, long before they acquired the franchise with which to control the government. Few of the members of Parliament were elected by popular vote prior to the Reform Act of 1832. Yet freedom of speech, separation of powers, the right to a jury trial, and the other hallmarks of a free society existed in Britain for generations before then.
That's awesome.
Perhaps an even more remarkable contribution of Britain to the growth of freedom in the world was its leading role in the destruction of the international slave trade, and then...
We watched the video on that, and that was an absolutely incredible video, and shout out to the British Empire for basically freeing slaves. You know what I'm saying? The destruction of the slave trade, absolutely incredible, and they not only did it, and not only... I'm not sure if they had... I think they did have slaves for a bit in British until William thought it was, like, immoral. And this shouldn't happen. All men and women are created equal, so people should not own people. They not only did it in Britain, but they actually fought against the slave trade around the world, is what I thought was truly, truly phenomenal. And I really rock with the Brits for that.
And of slavery itself. The magnitude of this achievement is hard to appreciate without first recognizing that slavery was a worldwide institution, entrenched on every inhabited continent, subjugating people of every color, language, and religion, and going back thousands of years.
Yes.
Moreover, the effort to stamp out slave trading, and later the institution of slavery itself, encountered widespread resistance and evasions in many regions of the world, producing a bitter struggle that lasted for more than a century. The dogged persistence of the British in that struggle was a key factor in the ultimate destruction of slavery around the world. Not all British leaders or colonial officials shared the ideals or the fervor of the anti-slavery movement, but the political pressures generated by that movement remained powerful and unrelenting throughout the 19th century and could not be ignored by any British government of any party during that era. It would be hard to find anywhere in history a record of any other country going to such efforts for so long in a cause from which it could gain so little and lose so much.
Facts.
When the British anti-slavery movement began in the late 18th century, Britain was itself the leading slave-trading nation in the world, and its slave plantations in the British West Indies and elsewhere were prospering and growing, producing powerful vested interests in London. Interests which were nevertheless crushed by the swelling moral revolt against the institution of slavery. One of the many ironies of history was that this leading slave-trading nation became the leading destroyer of the slave trade, and eventually of slavery itself. Another irony was that the strong vested interests which initially fought off the anti-slavery movement for 20 years in Parliament only succeeded in making that movement's ultimate triumph more sweeping than even its advocates could have hoped at the outset of the struggle. The protracted nature of that struggle led to ever wider public awareness of the issues and ever-growing public outrage against all aspects of slavery, ultimately sweeping the anti-slavery movement beyond its own original goal of abolishing the slave trade to seeking the abolition of slavery itself throughout the British Empire and then throughout the world. Organized opposition.
Thank God for the Brits once again, man. I can't say thank you enough. You feel me? Their role in the British Crusade against slavery and ending slavery around the world could never be right. Even though I guess they were part of the slave trade for years as well, but thankfully they realized that was something that was immoral. And like I said, not only did they end it in their land, but they decided to fight against it around the world. And like I said, slavery has been here since the beginning of time, right? Thousands of years. It had been something. So it wasn't like the British came up with slavery. They didn't invent slavery. But, I mean, they took part in it. But it was literally everywhere in the world. And they were the ones to decide to stand up against it. And you have to appreciate that.
To slavery arose in 18th century England among the Quakers, who began to require their members to free their own slaves. Evangelical members of the Anglican Church transformed anti-slavery sentiment into a political movement, with William Wilberforce and Henry Thornton leading the parliamentary battle for the end of the slave trade.
Love it.
Beaten badly in Parliament at the outset, the anti-slavery forces continued the fight until Parliament finally voted overwhelmingly to ban the international slave trade in 1808. By then, ever-widening opposition to slavery led to petitions from all parts of the country arriving in London with hundreds of thousands of signatures from people of the humblest ranks to those of the titled nobility. This was unprecedented in an era before mass communications or mass transportation. Banning slavery throughout the British Empire was more than simply a matter of enacting laws. Since slaves were legally property, their owners had to be compensated for their emancipation, and that cost the British government £20 million, a huge sum in the 19th century, when the pound sterling was of far greater value than today. Even this was not...
Does anybody know what that would equivalent? What's the word? What that would be today? How much money that would be today? 20 million pounds in the 19th century. What that would be in today's money. It'd be dope. Somebody could check it out. Drop it in the comment section.
The full cost of the anti-slavery crusade, however, for the British attack on slavery was not limited to banning it for Britons, but sought to stop other nations from engaging in the slave trade as well. Through political influence, economic bribes, and military threats, Britain was able to gain the acquiescence of many, though not all, nations to its boarding of their vessels on the high seas to search for slaves. Where slaves were found, they were freed, and the vessels confiscated. Powerful nations such as France would not submit to British pressure, and slave traders of various nationalities began to fly the French flag, with or without French permission, to avoid being boarded by the British. However, after the anti-slavery movement spread to France itself, the French then followed the British in abolishing slavery and in using their navy to patrol the seas in search of slave-carrying ships. After the American Civil War, the U.S. Navy also joined the anti-slave patrols in the Atlantic. Eventually, the anti-slavery crusade took root in the moral consciousness of European civilization as a whole, even in despotic countries such as Tsarist Russia, which stamped out the slave trade in Central Asia. The world dominance of Great Britain enabled it to impose its anti-slavery edicts on many other sovereign nations. Even while fighting a major war against Napoleon, Britain kept some of its navy on patrol off the African coast to intercept slave ships. Nor did it always confine itself to naval actions near Africa. In 1849, the British Navy struck at Brazil's slave ships in Brazilian waters. In 1849 and 1850, the British government took drastic action against the slave merchants in Brazilian territorial waters, in complete disregard of Brazilian sovereignty, with the intention of wresting a commitment from the Brazilian government to pass an effective anti-slave trade law and see to its enforcement.
Yeah.
Thoroughly humiliated by British incursions into the harbors of the empire and their seizure and destruction of Brazilian slave ships, even within Brazilian territorial waters, faced with threats to the legal shipping of the empire, with military conflict, and even a blockade of Brazilian ports, the government of the empire was compelled in July 1850 to accede to British demands in exchange for a promise to suspend the naval attacks.
Yeah. Went to in Brazilian territory. They said, y'all gonna stop it. Point blank period. It stops today. It's over. And know what I'm saying? Hey, the government of the empire had no choice. Had to listen to the British forces. Had to listen to the British Empire. I'm telling you, bro, the Brits, they really ended this ish. They really stopped it. They really shut it down.
Similar naval efforts at intercepting the slave trade from East Africa were carried on by the British for decades. The Arab and Indian slave traders in the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf responded like their European counterparts in the Atlantic by using smaller, sleeker craft designed to outrun or evade naval vessels. Moreover, Middle Eastern slave traders using smaller vessels were often able to sail in coastal waters too shallow for British warships. Although the East African slave trade had been surpassed by that of West Africa, it was by no means negligible. Well over 1 million human beings were shipped out of Africa as slaves in the 19th century from ports on the Indian Ocean or the Red Sea. British naval vessels, scattered over vast expanses of open water, could capture only a small fraction of the ships carrying slaves, often hidden among ordinary merchandise, rather than constituting the main cargo, as in the Atlantic. But the British Navy could impose risks and costs on slave traders, at sea and in ports, the cumulative effect of which was to reduce the traffic.
That makes
In
sense.
the Atlantic slave trade as well, the reduction in the number of slaves shipped from Africa to the Western Hemisphere was slight in the early decades of the 19th century, but unrelenting efforts at interception on the high seas over the years eventually destroyed the Atlantic slave trade by about 1860. By this time, the slave trade across the Sahara was also drastically reduced, partly as a result of a ban by the Ottoman Empire in 1857 under pressure from Britain. Gradually, grudging and piecemeal concessions by the Ottoman Empire reduced the importation of slaves from Africa, though much smuggling of black slaves continued, and the importation of white slaves from the Caucasus region continued to flourish. At one point, the British threatened to send warships into the Mediterranean to inspect Turkish ships and punish those found to be carrying slaves, if the Ottoman Empire did not do a better job of policing the slave trade itself. Aggressive British actions elsewhere in the world meant that this was not an idle threat. Resistance in the Islamic countries was formidable, sometimes expressed in armed uprising against both the Ottoman Empire and the British, but more often was expressed in widespread evasions of the ban on slave trading. Banning the institution of slavery itself long remained only a distant hope in much of Africa and the Middle East, even after it was a reality in the Western Hemisphere. Before the end of the 19th century, slavery was abolished throughout the Western Hemisphere, and the spread of European colonies and spheres of influence in Africa in the late 19th century meant that slavery was coming under increasing pressure there as well.
So it's more so in the Eastern Hemisphere after they abolished in the West. Some Eastern countries and nations and people were still trying to hold on to slavery and fight against the ban. But it seemed like the Britain were pressuring everybody. Y'all, either you gonna get rid of it or you gonna have to deal with us. And as Britain had made people deal with them before, it showed that they wasn't playing. People knew these wasn't just idle threats to Britain. The British were making it, so they had a choice, and it seemed like most of them chose, hey, let's get rid of the slave trade.
Slavery retreated before the advance of British power in Africa and Asia, as it was later to retreat before the advance of French and German power in Africa, before the advance of Dutch power in the East Indies, and the advance of Russian power in Central Asia. Yet the impetus for the abolition of slavery was a peculiarity of Western civilization. though some non-Western nations eventually began to move against slavery as a means of maintaining their national standing in the eyes of the world, which is to say, primarily the Western world. In a later era, Britain again played a key role in the defense of freedom when totalitarian governments sprang up between the two world wars of the 20th century, and many, even in democratic countries, called these aggressive, nationalistic, and racist dictatorships the wave of the future. That prediction seemed especially ominous when the early aggressions of Germany, Italy, and Japan in the 1930s and early 1940s succeeded time and again. After Nazi armies rampaged through Europe in the early years of the Second World War, winning an unbroken series of swift and stunning victories, climaxed by the fall of France in just 6 weeks of fighting, Britain faced the seemingly invincible forces of Nazi Germany alone. Few expected her to survive. Prime Minister Winston Churchill put the grim situation to his people and to the world. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Such a freaking incredible speech, man. Winston Churchill was absolutely... the speeches that I've heard from this man are truly, truly next level. But yes, I mean, and what he said in this speech was true, right? If Hitler had conquered Britain, then it would have been over for the rest of the world. And nobody thought that Britain had a chance. But Britain stood up against insurmountable odds and beat back the Germans and beat back Hitler and gave them their first loss and showed the world they can be beat. They can be stopped. And the rest is history.
As Churchill predicted, the full might and fury of the Nazis were turned on Britain. The dreaded massive bombing of the Luftwaffe, which had terrorized other nations into surrender, failed to break the British. Hitler was stopped for the first time. Britain, though lacking the military forces to launch a major counterattack, nevertheless stalled the Nazi timetable of conquest, thus buying time, not only for itself, but also for an almost completely disarmed United States to begin preparing itself militarily for the ordeal ahead. Many nations, forces, and events contributed to the final victory over Germany and Japan, but what made it all possible was that Britain withstood the fire and blast of war and refused to surrender, even when the situation looked hopeless. It was indeed their finest hour. Freedom survives in the world today because of it.
Shout out to the Brits, man. They did so much for the rest of the world. You can't even put it into words. And I truly, truly, truly think in watching these videos and actually learning about the true history, it's an incredible nation that have really shaped the world that we live in today. So that's all we have for this one. If you guys enjoyed that video, make sure you check out this reaction as well. It's just as good. Also, make sure you subscribe, and I'll see y'all on the next one. It's your boy Neal. Out.